When we hear the word Spanish Inquisition, most imagine whispered accusations, dark-robed priests, and fire-lit trials. But what truly earned the Inquisition its legacy of terror was its embrace of mechanical cruelty, especially the rack. Not just a myth from horror tales or medieval legends, the rack was real. A wooden frame, deceptively simple in design, capable of destroying a human body piece by piece. And during the height of the Inquisition, it became a centerpiece of confession. The device itself looked unassuming. A flat rectangular frame, slightly raised from the ground, with rollers on both ends. Ropes tied the victim's wrists and ankles to these rollers. With every turn of the handles, the rollers pulled, slowly, precisely, stretching the person's body farther than it was ever meant to go. At first, the pain came from tightness, joints pulled, muscles burning, a creeping sensation of the body resisting itself. But then came the dislocations, shoulders, knees, elbows, wrists, snapping one by one as the victim screamed and begged. Ligaments tore like wet paper, cartilage ripped loose, the vertebrae twisted unnaturally, the hips popped from their sockets, and still, the wheel turned. What made the rack so effective wasn't just the pain, it was the slowness. The torment was drawn out, minute by minute, under the calculated control of Inquisition officials. They believed that physical destruction would eventually force spiritual surrender. Records from the archives of the Consejo de la Suprema, wide General Inquisition, Spain's highest inquisitorial authority, detail hundreds of cases involving the rack. Victims ranged from suspected heretics and Protestants to converted Jews, and Muslims accused of secretly practicing old faiths. One chilling account from 1571 tells of a man named Tomás de Herrera, accused of secretly reciting Jewish prayers in private, brought before inquisitors in Toledo. Tomás refused to confess, so they stretched him. After 3 full turns of the rack, his arms were dislocated, his shoulder blades visibly lifted beneath his skin. He still refused. By the 5th turn, his legs had popped at the knees. His screams were recorded in the court notes. Finally, on the 7th turn, with his ribs reportedly cracking, he whispered, "I am broken. God forgive me." Confession obtained. Trial complete, but Tomás never walked again. Another infamous case was that of Isabel Perez, a midwife accused of spreading witch knowledge to young mothers. Her torture took place in the dungeons of Seville, where the humidity and mold made pain linger longer in the joints. Witnesses recorded that her body was so badly stretched, her height increased by nearly 6 inches. She survived, but could no longer move her arms, and her spine was permanently deformed. The church claimed these confessions were voluntary, but the rack ensured there was no difference between will and agony. What set the Inquisition apart from ordinary courts was its obsession with procedure. Every torture had to be approved, documented, and witnessed by religious officials. Torturers wore robes, prayers were read before sessions began, and the victim, no matter how mangled, was expected to repeat their confession afterward, freely, without the device present. The irony: the Inquisition often saw itself as merciful. Clerical journals from inquisitors like Fray Diego de Simancas show how some torturers believed they were saving the soul by destroying the body. One chilling quote reads, "Better for the body to be torn in this life than the soul to burn in the next." But not all were convinced. Some monks and confessors began to speak quietly of their horror. One wrote in the margin of a trial transcript, "Her screams reached the chapel, and yet we prayed on." The use of the rack wasn't limited to a single location. It spanned across Spain and the inquisitorial halls of Granada, Barcelona, Zaragoza, and Valencia. Anywhere the church suspected heresy, the rack followed. Torture wasn't meant to kill. That would rob the Inquisition of its legal and spiritual performance. Instead, the rack was about breaking the body, yes, but also the mind, the will, the memory, the identity. Victims left the rack no longer certain of what was real. Their own truth began to dissolve under the grinding of wood and bone, and the public never saw these moments. The rack was used in secrecy. Its chambers were soundproofed by stone and sealed with authority. Families were not informed. Loved ones disappeared and reappeared in shackles, whispering confessions with broken jaws and eyes that no longer focused. Those who refused even under torture were often sentenced to death. And if their bodies were too mangled to walk, they were carried, dragged to the autodafé, the act of faith, where their broken limbs were tied to stakes and their fractured spines set against wood. Flames followed. Their confessions, often signed with trembling hands or dictated through cracked lips, were read aloud as the fires rose. The rack did more than torture people. It reshaped them, physically and psychologically. It left survivors with arms that never moved again, backs that never straightened, and minds that never forgot. Some survived the rack with their lives, but they never left the chamber the same. Physicians of the Inquisition, trained not in healing, but in prolonging suffering, became experts in limits. They studied exactly how far tendons could stretch before snapping. They calculated how long a man could endure dislocation before going into shock. It wasn't science in pursuit of knowledge. It was anatomy and pursuit of obedience. One such physician, Brother Martin de Olmedo, created what he called the 7 levels of compliance. His guide listed, in clinical Latin, the progressive damage caused by the rack and the points at which most individuals either confessed or passed out. He noted that by level 5, the shoulders were usually torn free of their sockets and the jaw tended to lock. At level 7, few people could remain conscious, fewer still remembered their names. One of the most infamous documented sessions involved one Esteban, a young translator accused of introducing Protestant pamphlets into Spain. Officials suspected he was more than just a courier. They believed he was converting others. One denied the charges under oath. They took him to the rack. In his journal, the Inquisitor wrote, he withstood for turns. At the 5th, the bones of his right leg produced a snap loud enough to echo. At the 6th, he sobbed not from pain, but from shame. He confessed between screams. The chamber smelled of sweat and wet wood. These torture chambers weren't dank medieval basements. They were methodical, clean, spiritually sanctioned theaters of pain. Crosses hung on the walls. Psalms were read aloud between wrenchings. And in many cases, scribes stood nearby, quill in hand, writing down every moan, every plea, every name revealed under strain. Women, too, were not spared. Though female victims were less common due to the physicality of the rack, the Inquisition still used it on those they considered dangerously vocal or spiritually rebellious. One such case was Maria de los Angeles, a former nun who had reportedly claimed visions of the Virgin Mary instructing her to criticize the Church's cruelty. They branded her a heretic. Under torture, her arms dislocated almost immediately due to a pre-existing injury. Still, the torturer continued. She screamed that she could see angels. And then, in a moment of tragic irony, began praying for her torturer's souls. She died of internal bleeding 3 days later. No confession was ever recorded. As the Inquisition spread into the New World, the rack traveled with it, finding a place in colonial Mexico, Peru, and even parts of the Philippines. Though adapted slightly for new climates, the device remained essentially the same. Wooden frame, iron gears, ropes that promised nothing but agony. The Church defended its use by citing medicinal correction. Torture, they claimed, was not retribution, but purification. Pain was the fire through which truth was forged. A false confession, they believed, was the result of spiritual weakness. A real one, even under duress, was proof of guilt ordained by God. And what of the torturers? Many believed they were doing holy work. Others found enjoyment in their tasks. The name Domingo Echeverria appears in dozens of torture records across Madrid and Valencia. Known for his steady hand, he rarely broke protocol, but often suggested longer sessions. Witnesses describe his strange, calm. Even his victims screamed. He was known to whisper prayers while tightening the wheel. When questioned, at late in life, He said only this: "Their bodies cried, but their souls were silent. I gave them voice." Some victims were never named. They entered the chambers anonymously: foreigners, orphans, travelers with strange books. After being broken on the rack, their bodies were either buried in unmarked graves or burned, their ashes swept away without ceremony. But not all Inquisition officials were blind to the cruelty. In the early 1600s, Father Rodrigo Martinez, a young priest assigned to observe torture for accuracy, wrote in his personal diary, "I cannot see Christ in this chamber. I see only ropes and blood. I fear we mistaken judgment for mercy, and in doing so, have made devils of ourselves." His journal was later found and burned. Father Rodrigo was reassigned to a rural parish and never heard from again. One of the final recorded uses of the rack in Spain occurred in 1710. During a secret interrogation of a French Huguenot accused of espionage and religious heresy. Despite the Enlightenment spreading across Europe, the church still clung to old methods. The man's spine was ruptured. He died after 14 hours in captivity. His death wasn't even reported to local authorities. Eventually, as legal reform took root and public opinion shifted, the rack faded into obscurity. The Spanish crown, pressured by European powers and its own philosophers, began phasing out judicial torture. But the damage had already been done. For over 200 years, the rack served not just as a device of pain, but as a symbol of how far an institution could go when faith blinded itself to compassion. Today, fragments of these devices sit in museums, often behind glass, often misinterpreted as tools of another era. But they weren't just objects. They were extensions of belief. Belief that truth could be torn from flesh, that justice could be heard in the snap of a femur, that silence meant guilt and pain meant progress. And perhaps most chilling of all, the rack was not born from barbarism. It was born from bureaucracy, designed, approved, and implemented by educated men in robes. The torture wasn't lawless. It was legal. It wasn't savage. It was sanctioned.